Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. My name's Nick Park, and I'm taking us in a series of messages that are looking at each of the books of the Old Testament, and we're seeing how Jesus is at the center of the Old Testament. He is the lens through which we read Scripture. We're in the book of Numbers at the moment, and there's this wonderful passage in the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 21, about when the Israelites were in the wilderness, and there were these poisonous snakes, and the poisonous snakes were biting the Israelites, and they were dying of the venom of the snakes. And God told Moses to make a brass serpent, a brass representation of one of the snakes that was attacking them, and to put that snake up on a pole. And he said that everybody that looked at the pole in faith would live. It wasn't a magical pole, it wasn't a magical brass snake, it was simply a sign of putting faith in God's provision and God's remedy for a problem. That's always what we've got to do. We've got to put our faith in God's remedy, not devise our own remedies. And the people were healed when they looked at the brass serpent up on the pole. Now, later on, that brass serpent, by the way, the Israelites kept it, and they ended up worshipping it as an idol. We know this because in 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 4, we're told that King Hezekiah had to destroy it and cut it into pieces to remove the stain of idolatry from people worshipping the brass serpent that God had provided to save their lives. But, you know, Jesus, in one of the most amazing passages of Scripture, Jesus compares himself to the snake on the pole. We're all familiar with John 3:16. In John 3:16, it's, probably the most well-known passage of Scripture. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish, but will have everlasting life. But in the two verses just before that, John chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, Jesus compares himself to this snake. He says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, he said, so I too, if I be lifted up, the Son of Man will be lifted up, and that we're to come to him and be saved. And that strikes us as being really, really strange, because Jesus is using an illustration of a serpent to describe himself, as an illustration of himself. And of course, we're used to the serpent as the symbol of Satan, of the devil, of evil. Now, I remember a few years ago, I went to Armenia, and I was up in the mountains at this monastery for the Armenian Orthodox Church, and it was an amazing place. I mean, they had a bit of wood there as you went in that they claimed was part of it, because this was on the slopes of Mount Ararat. They claimed that was part of the ark. Somebody had gone up to the ark and rescued a bit of the wood, and they were keeping it there in the monastery. I don't know. It was a very old bit of wood, but who knows? But anyway, one of the things that really struck me was as I went round this Armenian monastery that they had representations of snakes everywhere, which sort of threw me. It felt sort of creepy and satanic. But of course, what they were saying was that, well, Jesus said that as the serpent was lifted up, so he too must be lifted up. And so they had all these representations of snakes. Even the bishops had like the crook, the staff with the curved bit on the top, but the curved bit was made in the head of a snake. I found that a bit strange. But here's the thing. Actually, it's perfectly fitting that Jesus would use the serpent as a symbol to describe himself, because the New Testament tells us, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21, that when Jesus was on the cross, he became sin for us. God made him who had no sin to become sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And what could become a better symbol of this than the symbol of sin and evil itself, the serpent representing Satan? But Jesus was lifted up on the cross. And today we don't look to a brass serpent, we look to the Son of God, we look to Christ crucified, and in him we see the healing for sin, sorrow, suffering, and shame. And for that, I thank God today, and I thank God that he foreshadowed that with this account of the serpent in the book of Numbers in our Old Testament. God bless you. Join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.